The air inside St. Mark's Baptist Church was thick with incense and whispered prayers. The congregation swayed to the music, their voices rising in unison, eyes closed, hands lifted toward the heavens. It was a Sunday like any other. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, the warmth of community binding them together. For many, this church was more than a place of worship, it was a sanctuary, a refuge from the troubles of the world outside. At the heart of it all stood Pastor William Carter. A man of faith. A leader. A guide. He spoke with conviction, his sermons moving the room like waves crashing against the shore. His words had the power to lift spirits, to mend broken souls. To those who knew him, he was a shepherd, leading his flock with unwavering devotion. And standing just a few feet away, directing the choir with a steady hand, was Sister Evelyn Moore. She was the voice of the church, the one who led the hymns, who filled the room with music that could bring even the most hardened hearts to tears. She had been there for years, faithful, unwavering, a woman who carried her faith like a torch in the darkness. But no one in that church, no one in that congregation, knew what was about to happen. No one saw the storm gathering beneath Evelyn's composed exterior. No one could have guessed that in just a few moments, the woman who had once led the church in song would bring it to its knees in terror. Then, it happened. The first shot rang out, shattering the sacred silence. A split second of confusion. Gasps. Screams. The pastor stumbled backward, his pristine white robe now stained with blood. A second shot. He collapsed at the foot of the altar, his hands clutching at the crimson spreading across his chest. The congregation froze, stunned, horrified, unable to comprehend what their eyes were witnessing. Some dropped to their knees in prayer, others scrambled for cover, the air thick with panicked cries. And there, standing before them, her hand still gripping the weapon, was Sister Evelyn. Her expression was unreadable. There was no hesitation in her stance. No sign of regret. Just a mother, a woman who had come to this church seeking answers. And when she found them, they weren't wrapped in scripture or cloaked in redemption. They were dripping in betrayal. In loss. In an unbearable grief that had been silenced for far too long. What could make a woman of such faith turn to violence? What could drive a mother to walk into the house of God and pull the trigger without a second thought? The answer lay in a secret buried beneath the church's sacred walls. A secret tied to the very man who now lay lifeless before his congregation. A secret that had cost Evelyn the one thing in this world she loved more than anything. Her daughter. To understand what led to the moment Evelyn Moore pulled the trigger in front of an entire congregation, we must step back. Long before the gunfire, before the blood stained the altar, before the sanctuary became a crime scene. We must go back to the beginning. St. Mark's Baptist Church had stood for over 50 years in the heart of the community. A place of worship, of solace. Generations had passed through its doors, seeking guidance, redemption, and a place to belong. Pastor William Carter had been the church's leader for over a decade. His sermons were electrifying, his presence commanding. He wasn't just a pastor, he was a figure of authority, a man deeply respected, even revered. People turned to him for counsel, for wisdom, for the reassurance that faith could weather even the darkest of storms. And Evelyn Moore, she had been a part of this church for just as long. A voice of the choir, a pillar of faith, a woman devoted to God and community. But above all else, she was a mother. Her daughter, Aaliyah, was the center of her world. A bright, promising young woman who had grown up in the very pews of St. Mark's, her childhood spent between Bible study, choir rehearsals, and Sunday school. Aaliyah had dreams, big ones. She wanted to go to college, to build a future beyond the four walls of the church. And Pastor Carter, he had promised to guide her, to be a mentor, a protector. What no one knew then was that the same man who stood at the pulpit preaching righteousness was hiding a terrible secret. A secret that would cost Aaliyah her life. Aaliyah was just 17 when she vanished. It started as an ordinary day, one of many in the Moore household. She had breakfast with her mother, hummed a tune as she got ready for school, and kissed Evelyn on the cheek before heading out the door. But she never made it home. At first, there was no panic. Maybe she was running late. Maybe she had gone to a friend's house. Maybe her phone had died. But as hours stretched into an entire night with no call, no message, only silence, Evelyn knew something was wrong. Desperation turned into dread as the days passed without a trace of Aaliyah. She went to the police, filed a missing persons report, plastered her daughter's face on street corners, church doors, social media. She begged the congregation for help, pleaded for prayers, for anyone to come forward with information. And Pastor Carter, he comforted her. Held her hand. Told her to have faith. What Evelyn didn't know was that the answer to her daughter's disappearance was much closer than she could have ever imagined. Weeks turned into months. Aaliyah was gone, and with each passing day, hope dwindled. Evelyn refused to give up, but the weight of the unknown threatened to suffocate her. And then, a revelation came. Aaliyah's best friend, trembling, reluctant, finally spoke. Aaliyah had been in a secret relationship. With someone older. Someone powerful. Someone she trusted. The words hit Evelyn like a punch to the chest. She couldn't believe it. Wouldn't believe it. But then came the messages. The secret phone calls. The whispered conversations Aaliyah had never told her about. The way the pastor had taken an unusual interest in her daughter's future. The truth was like glass shattering around her. And it got worse. Aaliyah had been pregnant. And someone powerful, had made sure that secret never saw the light of day. There was no hospital record. No name on the books. No official documentation. But the whispers were there. Aaliyah had been taken to a private clinic. She had never wanted the abortion. She had been terrified. And someone with influence, had made the decision for her. She never came home. Evelyn's world collapsed. The missing persons report had never been about a runaway teenager. It had been a cover-up. A calculated effort to erase Aaliyah, to silence her forever. And at the center of it all was Pastor Carter. Evelyn wasn't the same after learning the truth. Her prayers turned into something else. Something cold. Justice wasn't coming. The police had no leads. The case was slipping away. The man responsible for her daughter's death still stood at the pulpit, still spoke of righteousness and forgiveness, still held his head high as if he had done nothing wrong. Evelyn stopped singing. She stopped praying. And she started planning. Evelyn Moore had walked into that church knowing she would never walk out the same. Pastor Carter's sins were no longer hidden. Justice had come, not in a courtroom, not through an investigation, but at the very altar where he had once preached salvation. And as the sirens wailed outside, as the congregation cowered in terror, as she dropped the gun and raised her hands, Evelyn Moore stood taller than she had in months. She had lost everything. And yet, in that moment, she had nothing left to fear. The trial. The testimonies. The community divided, some calling Evelyn a murderer, others calling her a mother who had been pushed too far. The legacy of Aaliyah Moore, forever tied to the truth that had finally come to light. And the final question remains. Was it justice? Or was it revenge? The murder of Pastor William Carter sent shockwaves through the community. A man of God, gunned down at his own altar. A respected leader, a shepherd to his flock, his blood spilled in the very place he had once preached forgiveness and salvation. And the woman responsible? Evelyn Moore. The church's beloved choir director. A woman who had once led voices in worship, now accused of a crime that defied every teaching of faith. The question was no longer who had pulled the trigger. Everyone had seen it. The real question was why. And for that, Evelyn was ready to speak. The state argued that Evelyn had committed premeditated murder. That she had walked into that church, fully aware of what she was going to do. That this was an act of vengeance, pure and simple. But the defense had a different story. And it started with Aaliyah. For the first time, the full truth was laid bare before a court. The secret relationship. The abuse of power. The pregnancy that Aaliyah never wanted. The forced abortion. The cover-up. The church's silence. The defense argued that Evelyn hadn't just lost her daughter. She had been robbed of justice, robbed of the truth, robbed of the very system that was supposed to protect her child. And when no one else would hold Pastor Carter accountable, when the law had failed her, when the church had turned a blind eye, Evelyn had taken justice into her own hands. Was it legal? No. Was it right? That was for the jury to decide. The church was no longer whole. Some saw Evelyn as nothing more than a murderer, a woman who had let rage consume her, who had taken a life in cold blood. Others saw her as a mother who had been pushed too far. Some whispered that Pastor Carter had deserved what came to him. That he had been a hypocrite. That he had taken advantage of his position, preyed on the vulnerable, and when the consequences caught up to him, he had tried to erase them. But was that enough to justify murder? The debate raged on. The trial became national news. People from across the country followed every hearing, every witness testimony. Would Evelyn be sentenced to life in prison? Or would the jury see her as a grieving mother, a woman who had snapped under the weight of unbearable loss? After weeks of testimony, days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Evelyn Moore was found guilty, but not of first-degree murder. Instead, the jury convicted her of voluntary manslaughter. The judge, taking into account the years of suffering, the loss of her daughter, the abuse of power that had led to this tragedy, sentenced her to 15 years in prison, a far cry from the life sentence the prosecution had pushed for. For some, it was justice. For others, it was far too lenient. Evelyn was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, but she held her head high. She had spoken the truth. She had exposed the man who had taken everything from her. And most importantly, Aaliyah's story had been heard. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a murder. It was a story about power. About trust. About a system that had failed an innocent young woman. It was about a mother's grief, a pastor's betrayal, and a congregation forced to reckon with the truth. But most of all, it was about Aaliyah. Her name would not be forgotten. Her voice would not be silenced. And as long as people remembered her story, she would never truly be gone. Now, we turn to you. Was justice truly served? Did Evelyn Moore deserve a harsher sentence, or was she already punished long before she ever pulled the trigger? And most importantly, how many other stories like Aaliyah's go unheard? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, stories that demand to be told, subscribe to The Last Confession. Because every crime has a final truth.